2 days ago, something happened in the Strait of Hormuz that should have been a global emergency. A handful of tankers started moving again. Oil began to flow, and almost immediately, the headlines said the same thing. The crisis is easing. Hormuz is reopening. The world can breathe again. But that is not what happened. Iran did not simply reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran changed the rules for using it, because ships moving through this narrow stretch of water are no longer dealing with just a security risk. They are dealing with a new system. Advanced transit requests, Iranian-controlled procedures, designated routes, administrative approval, and the possibility of future fees once the current negotiation period ends. That means the question is no longer whether Iran can close Hormuz. We already know it can disrupt it. The real question is much more dangerous. Can Iran turn one of the most important waterways on Earth into a controlled checkpoint? Not a blockade, not a war zone, a toll gate. And if that is what is happening, then this is not just a story about Iran. It is a story about global oil, about China, about India, about Japan, about Europe, about every country that depends on energy passing through a corridor barely wide enough to fit on a map. Because Hormuz is not an ordinary shipping lane. For decades, it has been one of the pressure points holding the global economy together. A huge share of the world's seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas has historically passed through this one narrow route between Iran and Oman. Every day, tankers move through it, carrying energy that powers factories in Asia, heats homes in Europe, fuels airlines, keeps supply chains alive, and determines whether gasoline prices rise or fall thousands of miles away. And now Iran appears to be testing something very different from a traditional closure. Instead of saying nobody gets through, the new message may be closer to this. You can get through, but you get through under our conditions. That is a completely different kind of power. Because a blockade is obvious. A blockade invites military confrontation. A blockade creates a clear enemy and a clear problem. But a system of permissions, routes, insurance requirements, security procedures, and possible future charges, that is harder to fight. It is harder to sanction. It is harder to bomb. And it is much easier to normalize. Today I want to show you why this may be Iran's most important move of the entire conflict. Why America's enormous military power does not automatically solve this problem. Why the ships moving again may actually be part of a much larger trap. And why the real battle is no longer over who controls the water. It is over who controls the rules. I call this the chokepoint tax trap. And once you see how it works, you will understand why reopening Hormuz may not mean the crisis is over. It may mean the crisis has entered its most profitable phase. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. On a map, it looks almost insignificant, a thin strip of water between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. But this narrow channel connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then to the wider Indian Ocean. Behind it sit some of the most important energy exporters on Earth: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, Iran itself. For years, these countries have relied on Hormuz as the exit door for enormous volumes of oil and gas. And that is the key word here: exit door. There are pipelines, there are ports outside the Gulf, there are emergency routes, but there is no easy replacement for Hormuz at the scale the world needs. That means when traffic through Hormuz slows down, the effect is not limited to Iran. It hits countries that may not agree with Iran politically at all. Saudi oil exporters feel it. Qatari LNG exporters feel it. Asian buyers feel it. European markets feel it. Shipping companies feel it. Insurance companies feel it. And ultimately, ordinary consumers feel it. Because energy does not need to disappear completely for prices to rise. It only needs to become uncertain. A tanker captain does not need to be attacked to avoid a route. An insurer does not need to cancel every policy to raise the cost. A government does not need to declare an embargo for companies to start delaying shipments. That is why choke points are so powerful. They create fear before they create scarcity. And fear itself has a price. When commercial shipping moves through a normal route, the calculation is simple. How much fuel does the ship need? How much cargo can it carry? How long is the route? What is the insurance cost? But when a route becomes dangerous, everything changes. Insurance premiums rise, ships wait longer, crews demand additional protection, companies reroute cargo, ports become congested, delivery schedules collapse. Suddenly, every barrel of oil passing through that route becomes more expensive before it even reaches a refinery. This is why Iran does not need to permanently close Hormuz to gain leverage. It only needs to make the passage uncertain enough that everyone starts treating it differently. And that is exactly where the situation becomes more complicated. Because the old image of Iranian power in Hormuz was simple. Iran mines the water, Iran threatens tankers, Iran fires missiles, Iran closes the strait. That is a direct confrontation. But the new model is more subtle. A government agency issues transit procedures. Ships are asked to submit requests in advance, routes are designated, permissions are reviewed, fees are discussed, and suddenly the conversation changes. It is no longer only about military security, it becomes about administration, about regulation, about who has the authority to decide what safe passage looks like. That may sound technical, but technical systems can be more powerful than military threats, because military threats create resistance. Administrative systems create dependence. And once companies begin planning around those systems, once insurers price them into contracts, once governments quietly accept them to keep oil moving, the system becomes much harder to reverse. This is why the next 60 days matter so much. Not because every tanker that passes proves the crisis is over, but because every tanker that passes under a new set of rules may help establish a new reality. This is where the chokepoint tax trap begins. The trap works in 3 stages. Stage 1 is disruption. You make a route too dangerous, too uncertain, or too politically risky to use normally. You do not necessarily need to close it forever. You only need to prove that normal access can no longer be taken for granted. That changes the psychology of everyone involved. Shipping companies become cautious. Oil traders become nervous. Governments begin looking for diplomatic solutions, and insurance markets start treating the route as an exceptional risk rather than a normal commercial corridor. Stage 2 is controlled reopening. This is the moment that looks like de-escalation. A few ships move, some traffic resumes, officials say the route is open, markets relax, but the reopening does not happen under the old rules. It happens under new procedures. Advance notification, approved routing, security conditions, possible oversight, possible fees. This is important because it changes the meaning of access. The route is not free in the old sense. The route is available conditionally, and whoever sets those conditions gains leverage. Stage 3 is normalization. This is the most important stage because once companies begin complying with a new system, they may do it not because they agree with it, but because they need the cargo to move. That is how a temporary emergency measure can become a permanent source of power. Imagine a bridge that connects 2 major cities. One day, a crisis closes the bridge, then the bridge partially reopens. But now every truck must submit paperwork 2 days in advance. Every vehicle must use a designated lane. Every company must purchase special insurance. And after 60 days, a new charge may apply. At first, everyone complains, but goods still need to move. Workers still need to cross. Businesses still need supplies. So people comply. And after a while, the temporary rules stop looking temporary. They become the price of doing business. That is the trap. You do not need to own every ship. You do not need to control every port. You only need to control the bottleneck everyone else cannot avoid. And Hormuz may be the most valuable bottleneck in the world, because the countries using it are not weak. They are some of the largest energy exporters and importers on Earth. That creates an extraordinary situation. Iran does not need to defeat Saudi Arabia economically. It does not need to defeat China militarily. It does not need to defeat America directly. It only needs to make itself unavoidable. And being unavoidable is a form of power that military planners often underestimate, because a carrier strike group can destroy targets, a navy can escort ships, missiles can deter attacks. But none of those things automatically answer the political question. Who gets to write the rules for transit? America can say the strait must remain open. Iran can say the strait is open. Both statements can be technically true. But if ships are moving only through procedures that Iran has helped shape, then the real question becomes much more uncomfortable. Open for whom? Open under whose authority? Open at what price? And what happens when the current negotiation period ends? Because that is where the next phase of this story begins. Now, some people will hear this and say the answer is obvious. America has the strongest navy in the world. America has aircraft carriers. America has destroyers. America has submarines. America has surveillance aircraft, satellites, missile defense systems, and military bases across the region. So why can't America simply force Hormuz open? The answer is that opening a waterway militarily and making it commercially normal are two very different things. A navy can escort a tanker, but it cannot force an insurance company to offer normal rates. A warship can clear a route, but it cannot guarantee that a mine was not laid somewhere else. A military convoy can move one ship through a danger zone, but global energy markets depend on hundreds of commercial decisions made by companies, crews, ports, traders, banks, and insurers. And all of those actors have one thing in common. They hate uncertainty. That is Iran's advantage. Not necessarily because Iran can defeat the United States in a conventional naval war, but because Iran does not need to win a naval war. It only needs to make the cost of normal shipping too high. An asymmetric pressure is very different from conventional war. A cheap drone can create a massive security response. A mine can stop a convoy. A missile warning can delay a tanker. A GPS disruption can create confusion. A single attack can cause shipping companies to pause operations for days or weeks. The cost for Iran may be relatively low. The cost for everyone else can be enormous. That is what makes this type of conflict so difficult. The United States can spend millions protecting a route. Iran can spend far less creating enough risk to make companies hesitate. And the moment companies hesitate, the economic effects spread. Oil prices react, freight rates rise, governments begin calling for restraint. Allies start asking Washington how long the operation will last. And suddenly, the question is no longer only military, it becomes political. How much is America willing to spend to guarantee passage? How long can it sustain escort operations? What happens if a civilian ship is damaged under American protection? What happens if an American escort destroys an Iranian asset and escalation begins again? What happens if another regional front explodes at the same time? This is why Hormuz is such a difficult problem. It is a place where geography allows a smaller power to impose costs on a much larger one. The United States can dominate the sky, it can dominate open water, but Hormuz is not open water. It is a narrow corridor, and narrow corridors favor the actor closest to them. The actor with coastal missiles, the actor with small boats, the actor with drones, the actor with local intelligence, the actor with the ability to create uncertainty every day. That is not total control, but it may be enough. Enough to raise costs, enough to slow traffic, enough to make every transit a negotiation. And that is where Iran's strategy becomes more than military pressure. It becomes economic architecture. Because if a country can influence the cost of moving oil through a vital corridor, it does not just gain leverage over its enemies. It gains leverage over the entire global system, including countries that are not part of the conflict at all. The first people to pay for this are not necessarily in Washington or Tehran. They are in Asia. China is one of the biggest reasons Hormuz matters so much. India is another. Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and every major manufacturing economy dependent on stable energy imports. These countries do not need to agree with Iran politically to be affected by Iran strategically. They simply need oil and gas to arrive on time. And if Hormuz becomes slower, more expensive, or more conditional, then the cost does not stay inside the strait. It travels, it reaches refineries, it reaches shipping contracts, it reaches factory orders, it reaches airline tickets, it reaches consumer prices. That is what makes a toll gate model so powerful. The toll itself may not even be the biggest cost. The bigger cost is the uncertainty around it. If a tanker company thinks there may be new fees after 60 days, it has to plan for them now. If an insurer thinks new transit requirements could become permanent, it prices that risk now. If an oil buyer worries that the route may become unstable again, it seeks alternative supply now. And all of that increases the value of whoever can offer certainty. This is where China becomes especially important. China does not need to publicly support every Iranian move. It does not need to take ownership of the crisis. It simply needs to keep buying energy, Keep building alternative supply chains, and keep watching how American resources are used. Because every month America spends managing a crisis in Hormuz is a month when China learns. China learns how quickly the United States can move forces. China learns how much ammunition is required to sustain a major regional operation. China learns how allies react under pressure. China learns how markets behave when a choke point becomes unstable. And China learns something even more important. It learns that global power is no longer only about ships, aircraft, and missiles. It is about supply chains, insurance, data, ports, payment systems, energy contracts, and the ability to make other countries dependent on rules you help create. That is the deeper danger here. Iran may be trying to turn a military crisis into a long-term commercial advantage, not by conquering the strait, not by owning the global oil market, but by becoming the gatekeeper for a route no one can easily replace. And the longer this continues, the more difficult it becomes for other countries to reject the system without risking another disruption. That is why the current negotiation period is so important. The temporary fee waiver may sound like a concession, but it may also be a demonstration that Iran can make transit cheaper when it wants to, and more expensive when it wants to. A demonstration that passage is not simply a right, it is something that can be managed, conditioned, delayed, approved, or priced. And once that idea becomes normal, the strategic map of the Middle East changes. Because Hormuz stops being only a security problem, it becomes a business model, and business models can survive long after ceasefires collapse. So what happens next? There are 3 things to watch. First, watch the actual number of ships moving through Hormuz, not speeches, not press conferences, not declarations that the strait is open. Watch the traffic. If vessel movements slowly recover but remain far below normal levels, that tells you the commercial world still does not trust the route. And if shipping companies continue to wait, reroute, or demand higher insurance coverage, then Iran's leverage remains intact even without a full closure. Second, watch the details of the transit system. Do the advance notice requirements remain? Do ships continue using designated routes? Are there new safety procedures? Are insurers forced to recognize a new administrative authority? Do future fees become more specific? Because the details matter more than the headlines. A crisis does not become permanent because someone announces it. It becomes permanent because paperwork, insurance contracts, routing systems, and commercial habits begin to change around it. Third, watch what happens when the 60-day period approaches its end. That is the real pressure point. Because if Iran announces fees, new conditions, or expanded transit requirements, the world will have to decide what it is willing to accept to keep oil moving. And that decision will not be made only by Washington. It will be made by shipping companies, by Gulf states, by Asian importers, by insurers, by energy traders, by governments that may dislike Iran but dislike oil shocks even more. That is the choke point tax trap. You create disruption, you offer conditional relief, you establish a new system, and then you make the world choose between accepting your rules or risking another crisis. Iran may not control the Strait of Hormuz in the absolute sense. America may still have more military power. Oman may still play a critical role. International law may still matter. But power is not always about absolute control. Sometimes power is about controlling the moment when everyone else has no good options. And Hormuz may now be exactly that kind of moment. For decades, the question was simple. Could Iran close the Strait of Hormuz? But that was always the wrong question. The more important question is this: can Iran keep it technically open while making the entire world pay for access? Because if the answer is yes, then the strait is no longer just a waterway. It is no longer just a battlefield. It is no longer just an oil route. It is a pressure valve for the global economy. And whoever controls that pressure valve does not need to win every fight. They only need to make everyone else fear what happens if they stop cooperating. That is why the next 60 days may matter more than the conflict that came before them. Not because the ships are moving again, but because they may now be moving through a world where the rules have already changed. And the real question is not whether America has an answer. The real question is whether America even understands the trap before it becomes permanent.